Hello students, welcome to the series on business economics. Today we'll talk about the working of price mechanism. Before we start with our topic for today, that is working of price mechanism, we need to understand demand, supply, factors affecting demand and supply, consumers' equilibrium and demand forecasting. Meanwhile, we will be studying the various related graphs and curves. The objectives of this lecture are to make you thorough with the need of understanding of demand concept, the demand concept, meaning and definition of demand, demand schedule and types of demand. Scarcity is the mother of all the wants, and we know that resources are limited. These limited resources can be put to alternative uses, which arises the problem of choice making. Choice making leads to various economic problems. In the last lecture, we have talked about the basic problems of an economy and how a manager can use his analytical skill to resolve these problems. The significance of applying business economics concept was discussed so that manager can make the most rewarding decision and add to the nation's economy. Concept of business economics help the manager to analyze price, production and cost of the product. It is important for a manager to understand the link between the various economic variables. These various economic variables are demand, supply, cost and price. All these variables are interlinked. If one variable is missed, it has its direct impact on the other. This may result in loss to the firm on account of wrong decision taken by the manager. The success of firm entirely depends upon the decision-making ability of the manager and efficient use of resources. Understanding of economic variables is very important as it helps in effective decision-making. So we know that demand is the most important economic variable. Now we should talk about the concept of demand. Why do we need to understand the demand concept? What is the requirement for the managers and economists in understanding the demand concept? Let's take an example of McDonald's. Through flattening of the world, the 21st century witnessed a lot of activities related to exchange of manpower, technology and capital. Simple licensing and less complicated procedure for foreign direct investment made India the hot favorite destination for the foreign investors. Let's talk about the McDonald's story. McDonald's entered the Indian market in the mid-1990s. When McDonald's entered the Indian market, it was not able to capture a decent share of the Indian market. It was because its products were not customized to the Indian tastes. Other food giants used beef in their products. It hurt the religious sentiment of the Indians. Moreover, McDonald's overestimated the demand of burgers in India. McDonald's could not capture the Indian market earlier because of infrastructural bottlenecks, bureaucracy and high price of burgers. So McDonald's re-entered the Indian market with burgers matching the Indian taste through its burgers like Mac Aloo Tikki, Mac Maharaja chicken and more of the vegetarian delicacies. It changed its marketing strategy as well as offered a reasonable price for the burgers which was affordable by all the individuals in India. Most importantly, it analyzed the demand and studied the various factors influencing the demand of burgers. It was only through the estimation of demand and studying the various factors affecting the demand that McDonald's could assign the right price to its burgers. So demand affects the price. The purchasing power and living standard of people influence demand. Let us see how. This is the graph showing the trends in purchasing power parity or the GDP. In the year 2009, India ranked 4th amongst the countries with highest GDP. The country with the highest GDP in 2009 was United States. Its GDP was $13,820 billion, followed by China, Japan and India. The gross domestic product GDP is the value of all final goods or services produced in a nation in a given year, and purchasing power parity is the exchange rate, which is the sum total of all goods and services produced in the country valued at prices prevailing in the United States. GDP and purchasing power parity helps the economists to measure the per capita income, living standard of country's individuals, and the use of resources in the country. However, the exact measurement accuracy is difficult to achieve as US dollar value has to be assigned to all goods and services in the country regardless of whether these goods and services are directly equivalent or not. Also, many countries do not formally participate in the World Bank's purchasing power parity project that calculates these measures. So, the resulting GDP estimate for these countries may also not be accurate. Demand is one of the most important economic variables. It indicates the consumer's behavior towards the product of the firm. Consumers are sensitive towards price and quality of the product provided by the firm. So, a thorough demand analysis is very important on the part of the manager. The firm's product can hold a strong market share if proper demand analysis is done through demand forecasting. Through demand forecasting, the trend of consumer behavior can easily be traced and manager can take the decision on demand, supply and strategic decisions to maximize the sale of the product. Similarly, price plays a very significant role in the sale of the product on which the profit of the firm depends. First of all, manager has to analyze what kind of market he is competing in. Is it a perfect competition or monopolistic competition? On the basis of market analysis, pricing decisions take place. For example, pricing decisions are flexible in less competitive markets, but they have to be consistent over a period of time to avoid government intervention if it is not in the interest of the consumers. Let's talk about the demand concept. When an individual has a desire backed by the willingness to buy and ability to pay for that particular product, it is called effective demand. It is also important that the product should be available at a certain price, place and time. So, the features of this effective demand are desire to buy, willingness to buy, ability to buy, availability of the product demanded at certain time, place and price. In the words of Bauer, by demand we mean the various quantities of a given commodity or service which consumers would buy in one market in a given period of time at various prices. That is, the quantities which consumers are willing to purchase at a certain price in one market at a given period of time. It is important to understand the difference between demand and want. Want may be termed as a desire to buy a product, and this want converts into a demand only when it is backed by the ability to buy that product. Let us understand this effective demand with the following examples. An individual may have a desire to buy a car. This desire represents a want, as the individual may not be having the ability to pay for the desired car, but when this desire is backed by the ability to pay, then it is termed as demand. So, when the individual has a desire to buy the car, he has the ability to pay for the same, then this want converts into effective demand. Another example is when a child wants to buy a chocolate and he has rupees 10 to spend on the same. In this case, the child has a desire to buy the chocolate, he is willing to pay for the chocolate and he has the ability to pay for the chocolate at a certain place, time and price, then it is termed as demand. It is important to understand demand from two different viewpoints, that is, individual demand and market demand. Individual demand means an individual's demand for products or services in a given period of time at particular price. So when we take the individual's point of view for demand into consideration, then the decision to purchase will depend upon the individual's income. So the individual makes a choice to satisfy maximum of his wants with his limited income. Consideration of opportunity cost comes into scenario when an individual makes the selection of products and services. The opportunity cost can be measured by the individuals in terms of price they pay for the goods and services they forego. Let's consider the example of individual demand. Kindly have a look at this demand schedule. At price rupees 50, individual A's demand for chocolates is 5 units, and at price rupees 45, A's demand for chocolates is 10 units, and so on. Similarly, B, who is another individual, his demand at rupees 50 for chocolates is 10 units, and at price rupees 45, B's demand for chocolates is 15 units. Let's talk about the market demand. Market demand is the sum total of all the individuals' demand at a given point of time, or it can be said that the market demand in a given period of time is the sum total of all the individuals' quantity demanded at a given price level. Let's take the example of market demand into consideration. Kindly have a look at this market demand schedule. At price rupees 50, individual A's demand for chocolates is 5 units and B's demand for chocolates at rupees 50 is 10 units. Together, individual A and B's demand is the market demand, which is 15 units, and so on. So we understand that market demand is the collective demand of all the individuals. Let's talk about the demand schedule. What is the demand schedule? Demand schedule lists the prices and the quantity demanded for a particular product at a given period of time. It is a tabular presentation of quantity demanded and price of the commodity. It also indicates the changes in purchasing habits of the individuals depending on the price variation of a particular product. That is, when the price of the product is high, the quantity demanded will be low, and when the price is low, the quantity demanded will be high. In the words of Samuelson, the table relating to price and quantity demanded is called demand schedule, which means that the demand schedule is the presentation of the relationship between demand of the product at different prices in a tabular form. Demand schedule can be categorized into individual demand schedule and market demand schedule. Individual demand schedule is the presentation of the relationship between the demand of the product of a particular consumer at different prices in tabular form, whereas market demand schedule is the presentation of the relationship between the demand of the product at different prices by all consumers in the market in tabular form. According to Lebowski, market demand schedule is defined as the quantities of a given commodity which all consumers will buy at all possible prices at a given moment of time. Let's talk about the demand curve. Graphical presentation of demand schedule is called demand curve. That is, it shows the relationship between different quantities demanded at different prices. According to Leftwich, the demand curve represents the maximum quantities per unit of time that consumers will take at various prices. The demand curve represents the relationship between demand and price in a graphical form. The assumptions for construction of demand curve are: Only the price changes while other factors remain constant. Demand curves are of two types: individual demand curve and market demand curve. Individual demand curve is the graphical presentation of individual demand schedule. This curve represents the relationship of different quantities demanded at different prices by an individual. Look at this curve. Based on the individual demand, these are the various prices at which A's demand stands. Let's talk about the market demand curve. Market demand curve is the graphical representation of the market schedule and relationship between quantities demanded at different prices. Look at this market demand curve. Based on the demand schedule, these are the demands of A and B at different prices, and collectively these are the market demands, and this is the market demand curve. Although we will be discussing the demand curve in detail in the next lecture, demands are of different types. Let's talk about the different types of demand. There are 10 different types of demand. These are individual demand, market demand, income demand. Income demand is again divided into income demand for normal goods and income demand for inferior goods. Next is cross demand. Cross demand is divided into cross demand for substitute or competitive goods and cross demand for complementary goods. Next demand is joint demand, composite demand, direct demand, derived demand, competitive demand, and demand for unrelated goods. We have already talked about the individual demand and the market demand. So let's continue with the income demand. Income demand represents the income of an individual and the quantity demanded while the other things remain constant. That is, it is related to various quantities of a product bought by an individual at various income levels while other things remain constant. So it is assumed that price of the commodity, price of related commodities, taste, nature and habit of the individuals remain constant, while the demand and income of the individual keeps on changing. The income demand relationship is direct, which means when income of an individual increases, the demand of the commodity increases, and when the income of the individual decreases, the demand for the product also decreases. This can be represented as dx equals to Fy, where dx is the demand of X commodity and Y is the income of the individual. This is the demand function. The demand function expresses the functional relationship between demand of the commodity and factors affecting the demand. The income demand can be subdivided into demand for normal goods and demand for inferior goods. Let's talk about the income demand for normal goods. The demand for normal goods increases with the increase in income and decreases with decrease in income. The income demand curve, as you see in the graph, has a positive slope, that is, income demand curve is an upward sloping curve. Income demand for normal goods are price negative and income positive, that is, increase in price reduces the demand of the commodity and decrease in price increases the demand for the commodity, whereas when the income of the consumer increases, the demand increases, and when the demand decreases, it decreases with the decrease in the income of the consumer. So we can say that the demand of the commodity varies directly with the change in income of the consumer. The next category in income demand is income demand of inferior goods. In case of inferior goods, the demand decreases with the increase in the income of the consumer and increases with the decrease in the income of the consumer. There is an inverse relationship between the income and the demand, so the income demand curve is negative or downward sloping, as you can see in this graph. The example of inferior goods are coarse grain and coarse cloth. Now let's talk about cross demand. Change in price of one commodity results in change in demand of the other commodity. So the demand of one commodity affects the price of the related commodity. It is represented as dx equal to FPY. This is the cross demand function, where dx is the demand of commodity X and Py is the price of commodity Y. The cross demand is subcategorized into cross demand for substitute or competitive commodities or cross demand for complementary goods. Let's talk about the demand for substitute or competitive commodities. With the rise in price of one commodity, the demand for that commodity decreases and the demand for other commodity increases. For example, tea is the substitute of coffee. Consider this example. When the price of coffee increases, the demand for tea increases and the demand for coffee decreases. In the same way, when the price of tea increases, its demand decreases and the demand for coffee increases. The demand curve, as you can see in this graph, for substitute goods is upward sloping. Now let's talk about the demand for complementary goods. In this case, with the decrease in price of one commodity, the demand for other commodity increases. For example, with the decrease in price of sugar, the demand for tea increases, and when there is decrease in price of petrol, the demand for cars increases. As you can see in this graph, the demand curve for complementary goods is downward sloping. In case of related goods, change in price of one commodity results in change in demand of the other commodity. The direction of change entirely depends upon the relationship of these goods. In case of substitute or competitive goods, price of one commodity and the demand of other commodity moves in the same direction, whereas in the case of complementary goods, price of one commodity and the demand of other commodity moves in the opposite direction. Let's talk about the next category of types of demand, which is joint demand. Joint demand is also known as complementary demand. For example, pen and ink, petrol and automobile are all dependent on each other. The demand for such goods is price negative and income positive. That is, when the price increases, demand decreases, and when price decreases, demand increases. Whereas in case of income, when income decreases, demand decreases, and when income increases, demand increases. The next category is composite demand. Certain commodities have multiple uses. Take an example of resources like coal and electricity. Both have multiple uses. The demand for such resources is called composite demand. Now let's talk about the direct demand. Goods which are demanded for direct consumption like tea, coffee, ice cream, the demand for such goods come under the category of direct demand. Derived demand. Direct demand is for the commodities which are ready for the consumption, whereas derived demand is for the factors of production, like demand for laborers is a derived demand. For example, with the increase in demand for laptops, the demand for software engineers increases. Therefore, indirect demand for commodities is called derived demand. Now let's talk about competitive demand. The demand for substitute goods is termed as competitive demand. The most common example is due to the increase in price of desi ghee, it is becoming dearer and the demand for vegetable oil is increasing in India. Similarly, with the increase in price of gold, the demand for artificial jewelry is increasing. Let's talk about the last type of demand, which is demand for unrelated goods. Goods whose demand remains unchanged due to change in price of other goods is called demand for unrelated goods. For example, increase or decrease in the price of onions or apples will not affect the demand of furniture and stationery items because they are completely unrelated. So now we know why we need to understand the concept of demand. We know the demand schedule and we are aware of the various types of demands. These were the various types of demands. So now we understood the various types of demands, that is individual demand, market demand, income demand for normal goods and income demand for inferior goods, cross demand for substitute or competitive goods, cross demand for complementary goods, joint demand, composite demand, direct demand, derived demand, competitive demand and demand for unrelated goods. So now we know the demand concept, demand schedule and various types of demands. Now we have understood the impact of various types of demands with reference to the income of the individual. Impact of increase or decrease in the price of a commodity on the demand of that particular commodity. The impact of demand of one commodity on the demand of the other related or competitive commodity. We have also understood the increase or decrease in the demand of the product of the firm results in the increase or decrease in the sale of that particular product of the firm. The profit of the firm entirely depends upon the sale of the firm. Higher sales results in increased revenue for the firm and firm lasts longer in the market. On the basis of demand, the management of the organization takes decisions on various strategies. The marketing, sales and production department of the organization keeps an eye on the current market demand trends for the product manufactured by the firm. And on the basis of this, various strategic decisions are taken. So, it is very important to understand the demand analysis. So, now we know why we need to understand the concept of demand, demand schedule and various types of demand. So, on the part of manager, it is very important to understand the demand trends and respond to those by coming up with the strategies that can maximize the sale of the firm's product. Thus, to conclude, it can be said that now we know that there are 10 different types of demands. It is significant to analyze the demand and forces of demand to maximize the revenue of the firm. The firm with products suffering from inadequate demand do not succeed in generating sufficient revenue and closes down the operation and has to move out from the market. Demand analysis helps the firm to determine the price of the product and the quantity to be produced by the firm. It helps in forecasting the sales and help in formulating the marketing strategies for the growth of the organization. In the next lecture, we will study the law of demand and demand forecasting, so we will be in a better position to understand demand analysis. Thank you, students.